Knowledge Products presents Giants of Philosophy, narrated by Charlton Heston. This is tape number 1 on Plato.
Almost 2,300 years after Plato died, a 20th century British philosopher, Alfred North Whitehead, paid him a brief but striking tribute.
The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato.
It's tempting to judge this statement as a friendly exaggeration, but there are good reasons for taking it seriously, perhaps even literally. Plato and no other first asked and brought together in a systematic way the issues and questions that have defined the work of philosophy ever since. It's no overstatement, then, to say that philosophy came into existence with the thought and writing of Plato. In this sense, later philosophers, as Whitehead asserts, carry on the project that Plato first began. To be sure, the generations of philosophers since Plato haven't always agreed with the answers Plato proposed to his own questions. These disagreements continue up to the present day, and they have at times been bitter indeed. So, for example, another 20th century philosopher, Karl Popper, writes these harsh words about Plato's political philosophy.
Plato compromised his integrity with every step he took. He was forced to defend lying, political miracles, tabooistic superstition, the suppression of truth, and ultimately, brutal violence.
It may be hard to imagine that these words describe the same Plato Whitehead praised. Yet so it is. And in one respect, there's no contradiction here. Even Popper would agree that in the history of philosophy, Plato must first be reckoned with, today no less than in the past. As for any great writer, we can read Plato's writings now as if he were indeed our own contemporary. We'll find, in fact, that this is the best way of understanding what Plato was attempting to do in his own time. The tribute Whitehead paid to Plato needs to be taken seriously in a second sense as well. The image conveyed to us through Plato's life and work of what it means to be a philosopher. Plato says it's possible to live, to write, and to teach in a way that raises the questions of philosophy not as logical exercises or theoretical possibilities, but as issues that are alive, practical, and most important of all, unavoidable. For Plato, philosophy originates always in the immediate world of everyday life. It's there, in commonplace experience, that people first become aware of what Plato called the sense of wonder. This wonder marks the beginning of philosophical thinking. And in that beginning, philosophy is nothing if not practical. Like people in many generations before us, we often find ourselves driven to ask about the difference between justice and injustice, or between true knowledge and subjective opinions or beliefs. We ask about the line that separates good from evil, right from wrong. And most generally, we wonder for ourselves and for other people about how life ought to be lived. Ought to be. What constitutes a full and complete life? These are the questions that set philosophy in motion, not only for philosophers, but for everyone. Just to be capable of reason, the natural capacity that for Plato distinguishes humans from other beings, is to encounter the problems of philosophy. Reason itself wants to know the answers to philosophy's questions. In this sense, philosophy is both natural and inevitable. It's something we can't not do. The only question is whether people will do it well or badly, deliberately or unconsciously, and much of what Plato says has to do with how these alternatives are determined. In its Greek origins, the word philosophy means love of wisdom. Philo, meaning love, Sophia, meaning wisdom. Plato believed the love of wisdom is set in motion whenever human reason encounters the events and objects of the world, as it constantly does. Plato's own life was tied in an unusual way to another life as well, that of Socrates, who was Plato's teacher. Socrates remained a central figure in Plato's thought and writings. Even aside from Plato's testimony, other evidence suggests that Socrates was a remarkable teacher. But in addition to his teaching influence, certain historical events of Socrates' life also impressed themselves urgently on Plato, as they did more generally on the city of Athens, where they both lived. The most important of these events in Socrates' life was its end, the fact and circumstances of his death. Socrates had spent his days as a gadfly, a self-appointed teacher. Walking the streets of Athens, he chose for himself the role of questioner, He asked questions of anyone he met. Questions that reflected his own sense of wonder about politics, about ethics, about education. Socrates himself describes this role.
It is as though Athens were a large, thoroughbred horse, which because of its great size is inclined to be lazy, and needs the stimulation of some stinging fly. It seems to me that I have been attached to this city to perform the office of such a fly, and all day long I never cease to settle here, there, and everywhere, rousing, persuading, reproving.
Since Socrates lived in Athens, the questions he asked applied most immediately to that city-state. How it was governed, what the ethical ideals and practices of its citizens and their leaders were. These questions were often embarrassing and annoying. More often than not, the people he addressed couldn't answer him. And since these people sometimes had power, they eventually decided to take action against Socrates, to stop his questions not by answering them, but by silencing the questioner. So Socrates, at the age of 70 in 399 BC, was brought to trial on trumped-up charges of corruption and impiety. He was found guilty of the charges and then executed. Athens thus attacked the man who, for Plato and others of his students, had become its main symbol of integrity and wisdom. This attack marked a turning point in Plato's life, with lasting consequences for him. Through Plato's writings, Socrates' death has influenced the history of Western thought. Our acquaintance with Socrates' history has an unusual basis. Socrates had quite consciously decided not to write philosophy, but only to speak it. So Socrates left no written record of his thinking. For Socrates, philosophy had to be always alive, in motion, an active process like speaking itself, and this seemed to conflict with what he saw as the inert, inflexible character of written words. Obviously, since Plato did write, he disagreed with Socrates to some extent on the proper role of the philosopher. But even with this difference, Plato remained close in spirit to Socrates. Everything that Plato wrote, with the exception of a number of letters, took the form of dialogues, conversations which involved the exchange of ideas and sometimes arguments among a number of speakers. In these dialogues, the speaker who is mainly responsible for the direction in which the dialogues go and the conclusions they reach is Socrates. Like Socrates, Plato believes that the truths of philosophy are not the words that appear on a written page, but the spark that the words strike in the mind or soul, inside the person. So Plato writes in one of his letters,
The principles of philosophy cannot be put in words like other studies. Acquaintance with them must come after a long period of instruction and of close companionship. Then, suddenly, like a blaze kindled by a leaping spark, knowledge is generated in the soul and sustains itself there.
Plato paid homage to his teacher and also wrote in a way that recreated Socrates' oral method. This process has come to be known as the Socratic method. Because Plato's dialogue presents Socrates as their main character, it's almost impossible to distinguish between Socrates' thought and Plato's. Although he's the author of the dialogues, Plato refers to himself in them only twice, and even then he doesn't speak in his own name. When we hear from Socrates in the dialogues, then, it's not clear whether we're listening to Socrates or to Plato, or even perhaps to someone else. We can't even be certain how literally the words are meant. It'd be interesting to have this information, but it doesn't make much difference in understanding the dialogues themselves. In the dialogues, singly and in relation to each other, the central questions of philosophy are formulated in a way that speaks to the audience, much as if the individual reader or listener were part of a conversation. And of course, the dialogues are conversations. The reader or listener is meant to participate in the dialogue, to find a place for himself there as a character, not just to read or listen to it. If answers to the questions of philosophy emerge in the dialogues, then they come from the reader or audience as much as from the author. Call this process Socratic, or call it, after its most immediate author, Platonic. In watching the process develop in Plato's dialogues, we gain a full and coherent view of the life and work of philosophy. It's a view that has never been surpassed, and it's rarely been equaled. Plato was born in Athens in 428 BC. Athens at the time was a city-state in Greek, a polis, with a total population of less than 200,000. But even that number includes a substantial slave population and a considerable number of aliens. The number of citizens was less than 50,000 and was thus small by modern standards. Athens' small size is even more notable considering its unusual achievements, especially in the 5th century BC. The first half of that century saw notable advances in the development of the arts, in sculpture, architecture, and in literature. This was also a period of innovative developments in legal institutions, political organization, and in the expansion of trade and commerce. By Plato's time, however, the creativity and sense of adventure in this unusual community had worn thin. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and its main rival Sparta had begun 3 years before Plato was born. It continued intermittently for almost 30 years, until 404 BC, when it ended with Athens' defeat. That defeat provoked a revolution against the democratic government of Athens. Soon, a counter-revolution restored a version of the earlier democracy. This restored democracy was responsible for the execution of Socrates, an event that later influenced Plato's opposition to the democratic form of government. Plato's family was prominent in Athens, and the sense of privilege with which he grew up drew him towards a role in public life. Plato speaks about this in an autobiographical letter.
I cherished, like many another youth, the hope of entering upon a political career as soon as I came of age.
But the social turmoil of the time, and then the execution of Socrates, convinced Plato that he was unlikely to realize his goal of a just and good society by pursuing a career in politics. Something more was required. Plato found this in the study of philosophy, in teaching, and in writing. Only with a basis of that sort, he surmised, would politics have a chance of success. Thus, again in his autobiographical letter, Plato describes his growing conviction that a just society was impossible unless certain difficult conditions were met.
Either those who rightly and genuinely follow philosophy must acquire political authority, or those who have political control must become real philosophers.
Plato was not optimistic about the chances for these alternatives. His own experience with practical politics gave him good reason for doubt. On 2 different occasions, he accepted invitations from the ruler of Syracuse on the island of Sicily to visit there. He was invited to offer advice on how philosophy might work in actually governing a state. The first visit ended with Plato's imprisonment by an impatient and jealous ruler. The second was followed by the overthrow of the government, which was then replaced by a harsh dictatorship. Plato could reasonably conclude from these mishaps that his energies would be better spent elsewhere, perhaps in teaching the group of students who'd begun to assemble around him. If it was futile, even dangerous, to apply philosophy directly to political institutions, philosophy could at least be embodied in students who might later shape those institutions as leaders. So Plato, returning to Athens from his first visit to Syracuse in about 385 BC, founded a school. This school later gave its name to many others. Plato called it the Academy, after the grove in which the school was located, and which was dedicated to Academos, a Greek hero. Little is known about the actual organization of Plato's Academy, but it's reasonable to suppose that the ideals of education and the curriculum that Plato lays out in his writings were tried out in his own school. We might also guess that the method of instruction there resembled his dialogues, with a give and take, the question and response of the Socratic method. After Plato's death in 348 BC, the Academy survived under the direction of Plato's students, and then of their students. It continued to exist for almost 900 years, until it was forced to close under a general policy of repression by the Emperor Justinian in 529 AD. The main source of information that we have about both Plato and Socrates is located in Plato's dialogues themselves. As we've seen, there's an irony in this. Socrates had avoided writing, and Plato shared his reservations about the relation between writing and philosophy. In his dialogue entitled The Phaedrus, Plato offers a striking statement about that relation. We hear Socrates speaking with a quiet emphasis.
You know, Phaedrus, that's the strange thing about writing which makes it analogous to painting. The painter's works stand before us as though they were alive. But if you question them, they maintain a majestic silence. It is the same with written words. They seem to talk to you as though they were intelligent, but if you ask them anything about what they say, they go on telling you just the same thing forever.
Socrates thus stresses that writing, as soon as it leaves its author's hands, becomes something quite different from the spoken word. Like painting, it gives the appearance of a physical object, but truth and knowledge occur in the mind, which is not material or physical at all. Only direct conversation, where the participants can examine the meaning of what's said, is capable of steering a course to knowledge. To be sure, Plato himself did write. The standard edition of Plato's work includes 28 dialogues. But as dialogues, these writings represent the spoken word. They retain its live quality, and they avoid assertions of doctrine or the bulky appearance of a philosophical system. On the other hand, the dialogue form of writing makes it difficult to determine exactly what philosophical views or theories are actually being proposed. It's not always clear even which views are being attacked or rejected. Nonetheless, certain themes recur in Plato's writings, and we can infer that Plato attaches special importance to them. These can be grouped under several distinct headings, but it's important always to keep in mind that Plato emphasizes the close connections among these and indeed among all philosophical topics. Plato's sometimes been called the great unifier because he emphasized similarities rather than differences, connections rather than divisions, the one rather than the many. So, for example, when Plato considers the problems of political theory, he also refers to the theory of knowledge and the philosophy of art. When he defines the questions of ethics, he shows them to depend on issues of psychology and metaphysics. Nonetheless, it is possible to draw some distinctions among Plato's subject areas, and we'll be focusing here on three different, although related, areas of Plato's thought: his ethical theory, his political philosophy, and finally a combination of his theory of knowledge and his metaphysics. We turn first, then, to Plato's ethical theory. In Plato's own thought, no more important starting point for understanding ethics could be found than by beginning with the life of Socrates. Here, Plato finds a justification for philosophy and an ethical ideal to which all students of philosophy might aspire. Since Socrates' life serves as an ideal, Plato insists on writing about Socrates himself in the writings which bear most directly on ethics. He does this in a sequence of three dialogues, called the Apology, the Crito, and the Phaedo, which describe the trial, the imprisonment, and finally the execution of Socrates. These three dialogues are based on the events at the end of Socrates' life, but they're probably not strict historical records. The statements attributed to Socrates undoubtedly resemble what he actually said. Even if we can't be certain about this, though, we can be certain about the ethical commitment shown in Socrates' trial and death. We can be certain about the connection revealed here between the ethical decisions and the use of reason. Here, too, we find Socrates' famous statement, as compelling as it is brief.
The unexamined life is not worth living.
These words, spoken at a time when Socrates' own life was at stake, demonstrate how powerful the role of reason was for both Socrates and Plato. Not only for theoretical questions, but for the practical question of how anyone, ought to live. In the Apology, Plato presents a version of Socrates' speech as he defends himself at his trial. The jury of 500 Athenians, selected by lot, have heard the charges against him. He's accused of corrupting the young people among his followers and of impiety against the Athenian gods. It's evident that behind these charges, perhaps even more important than the charges themselves, there was a sharp personal animosity against a man who had often challenged and embarrassed the leading figures of Athens. Political leaders in the polis had claimed to rule for the good of the people, but in fact they served their own interests. Poets exerted a strong influence on popular beliefs, but they didn't always understand or believe what they themselves said. Rhetoricians and other teachers, known as the sophists, professed to be able to teach anyone to succeed at anything, whether it was worth doing or not. All of these people had been challenged by Socrates, in a relatively small community where anything interesting was soon known by everyone. It's not surprising, then, that an attempt would be made to silence Socrates. When he speaks in his own defense, Socrates attempts first to explain the antagonism that led to his trial. He does this by relating an episode that involves the Oracle of Delphi, a religious figure revered by the Greeks for her wisdom. Chaerephon, a friend of Socrates, had traveled to Delphi to ask the oracle whether she knew anyone wiser than Socrates. The oracle replied that indeed no one was wiser. When this statement was reported to Socrates, he tells the jury, he was puzzled. On the one hand, he didn't consider himself wise. On the other hand, the oracle would not be mistaken. In order to determine what the oracle meant, Socrates began then to talk to other Athenians, to ask them questions about themselves and about their work. In these discussions, Socrates discovered that the people he spoke to, the politicians, the poets, the teachers, were far from being the authorities they were supposed to be. They didn't, in fact, know what they claimed to know, and Socrates concluded that this undoubtedly was the basis for what the oracle had said. Socrates believed he did not possess knowledge or wisdom, and in this respect he was just like many other Athenians. But he was wiser than they were in another respect. Socrates knew that he didn't know, whereas they thought they had knowledge when they did not.
I gave a thorough examination to this person, I need not mention his name, and in conversation with him I formed the impression that although in many people's opinion, and especially in his own, he appeared to be wise, in fact, he was not. Then, when I began to try to show him that he only thought he was wise and was not really so, my efforts were resented both by him and by many of the other people present. However, I reflected as I walked away, well, I am certainly wiser than this man. It is only too likely that neither of us has any knowledge to boast of. But he thinks that he knows something which he does not know, whereas I am quite conscious of my ignorance.
This profession of ignorance by Socrates has since become known as Socratic irony. In it, ignorance too becomes an object of knowledge. But Socrates' irony is more than only a manner of speaking or of showing up his opponents. Ignorance by itself, for Socrates, is not necessarily harmful. Ignorance becomes harmful when a person's not aware that he lacks knowledge. The ignorant person then has no reason to examine himself and to learn. Knowing that one doesn't know is a form of wisdom, and Socrates claims this wisdom for himself. Of course, in repeating this claim at his trial, Socrates could only add insult to injury. It surely didn't help his cause. But the method he uses at his trial is the only one he knows. He speaks the truth and directs it at the people who most need to hear it. Socrates tells the jury,
I am not arguing in my own defense, but rather in yours, since you will not easily find someone else who, like me, clings to the state as a sort of gadfly.
Nor is Socrates willing to change his opinions or his method because of the possible consequences of what he says. To do this would be to repeat the mistake of not recognizing one's own ignorance.
Even to fear death, my friends, is also to think ourselves wise without really being wise. For it is to think that we know what we do not know.
Socrates' honesty and consistency were not enough to convince his jury. As Socrates himself points out, the vote against him is surprisingly close, 280 to 221. The 501st vote was by custom attributed to the goddess Athena. All was in favor of acquittal. But the jury's first verdict was not the end of the matter. A second vote was required to determine Socrates' punishment. In ancient Athens, a defendant was permitted to suggest an alternate punishment to the one proposed by his accusers. The jury would then choose between the two. In his case, Socrates' accusers sought the penalty of death. Here Socrates faces a dilemma. If he proposes a real punishment, he would be accepting the jury's verdict. But his view of that verdict is no different from before. He considers himself guilty of nothing more than attempting to educate the people he encountered, of trying to enable them to know themselves. He'd carried on this work, what's more, with no profit to himself. Unlike other teachers then and now, Socrates didn't accept fees for his instruction. Knowledge is not something he believes that should be bought and sold. In any event, he doesn't think of himself as having knowledge, except for the knowledge that he does not know. So Socrates asks the jury,
What is it that would be proper for me to pay? For neglecting what most people care about: money-making and housekeeping and military appointments. For trying to persuade each one of you how he could become most good and most wise before he took care of any of his interests. What do I deserve, since I am such as that?
And then he answers his own question.
Something good, gentlemen, if I am to say what it ought to be in truth. And further, something good which would be suitable for me. So, this is my estimate of the just penalty according to what I deserve. Free board in the town hall.
Socrates points out that this was the reward usually given to the winners of prizes at the Olympic Games. It must have been as obvious to Socrates as it is to us now that this proposal would not win over his jurors. For them, it was important that he should admit his guilt. At the very least, they wanted to humiliate him. Even when Socrates, at the urging of his friends, adds that he would be willing to pay a small fine, it's too little and too late. The jury is forced to choose between the punishment of death and the strange combination of punishments proposed by Socrates. Faced with this, the jury sentences Socrates to death. So, even when he confronts the prospect of the death penalty, Socrates doesn't compromise. He once again reminds the jury, after they reach their decision, about his reason for this refusal.
The difficult thing is not to escape death, but to escape wickedness. And now I, being slow and old, have been caught by the slower one. But my accusers, being clever and quick, have been caught by the swifter one. Evil.
He concludes his speech at the trial with a last wish.
One thing only I ask my accusers. Punish my sons, gentlemen, when they grow up. Give them the same pain I gave you. If you think they care for money or anything else before virtue. And if they have the reputation of being something when they are not, reproach them as I reproach you, that they do not care for what they should.
On that note, the trial of Socrates and the dialogue called the Apology comes to an end. But the account of what happens to Socrates after the trial continues in the second dialogue of the trilogy. The second dialogue is named the Crito, after a friend of Socrates who appears in it. At the opening of the Crito, Socrates is in prison. Crito informs him that a ship which has been sent on a sacred mission from Athens is expected to return the next day. While the ship's away, no executions can be carried out. But the news of its return means that time is running out. Crito tells Socrates of a plan. He and other friends have raised enough money to bribe the jailers to allow Socrates to escape. Crito tells him that many cities would welcome him if he were willing to leave Athens. Surely he shouldn't sacrifice his life needlessly. By allowing Athens to carry out the death sentence, Socrates would be contributing to a miscarriage of justice. At the same time, he'd be abandoning his friends and his family. So Crito urges Socrates.
There, Socrates. If you aren't careful, beside your suffering, there will be all this disgrace for you and us to bear. Come, make up your mind. Really, it's too late for that now. You ought to have made it up already. There is no alternative. The whole thing must be carried out this coming night. If we lose any more time, it can't be done. It will be too late. I appeal to you, Socrates. Take my advice and don't be unreasonable.
Crito's words of counsel seem compelling, and there's reason to believe that even Socrates' enemies half expected him to escape. But here, as always, Socrates finds questions to ask, questions which undermine Crito's argument and which, in Socrates' view, Crito has ignored. What's at stake is not only Socrates' life, but certain basic principles. So Socrates reminds Crito.
We must value most not living, but living well. And we must then first examine whether we shall be doing right in paying money to those who will get me out of this, or whether we shall be doing wrong. We must not, after all, do wrong in return, or do evil to anyone in the world, however we may be treated by them.
Socrates wonders whether justice would be served by his escape. And here his objections to Crito's plan begin to emerge. Crito has failed to consider a crucial question about the relation between the individual and the state. This relation imposes heavy obligations on the citizens, Socrates points out. These obligations are evident in the similarity between the laws of a country and one's parents. By means of the laws, Socrates suggests, people are educated and receive their values. Like a parent, then, the state is responsible for the moral character of its citizens, for the people they become. By escaping from prison, Socrates would be rejecting those laws, much as if he were to attack his own parents because he disagreed with the decision they made. By agreeing to escape, Socrates would be denying more than the verdict. He'd be rebelling against all the laws of Athens, against the authority of the state, and in effect, against the state itself. At the very least, he'd be claiming that the state had no right to judge him. And Socrates' response to this is clear.
Violence is not allowed against mother or father, much less against your country.
Socrates calls to Crito's attention a second and even stronger objection. A man's free to leave his country at any time. If he chooses not to leave, but to remain, he in effect signs a contract with the country to obey its laws. It would be wrong for him to break this agreement just because he sometimes objects to a particular law. This is all the more true if it's not a law he finds fault with, but a person or group of people who misapply the law. Socrates claims that this is indeed what's occurred at his trial. He's been wronged not by the laws, but by human beings. For him to act as if the laws or the state were culpable, then, would itself be an injustice. Socrates imagines what the laws themselves would say if they could speak.
Now, Socrates, what are you proposing to do? Can you deny that by this act which you are contemplating, you intend, so far as you have the power, to destroy us, the laws, and the whole state as well? Do you imagine that a city can continue to exist and not be turned upside down if the legal judgments which are pronounced in it have no force, but are nullified and destroyed by private persons?
With this conclusion, Socrates rejects Crito's proposal. Crito himself concedes that there's nothing more to say. Socrates doesn't claim here that everything a state or country commands a citizen to do is just. He's not even saying that he himself would obey every law or decision adopted by Athens. Socrates had made clear earlier at his trial that if the jury told him he could continue to live in Athens if he changed his way of life, if he stopped his questioning, for example, he would not agree to this. He would go on doing exactly what his conscience told him to. The state, with all its power, couldn't force him to stop doing what he thought was right. But although Socrates might disobey that particular decision or law, he wouldn't even then be rejecting the state as a whole. He'd do what he felt he had to do, on the grounds of reason and conscience. The state, on the other hand, would do what it chose to do, and this included executing Socrates. In taking this position, Socrates presents the first known defense of the principle of civil disobedience. A citizen chooses to disobey a law or decree of the government, but he does this publicly and agrees to accept the state's punishment for breaking the law. Civil disobedience forces the state to re-examine its own conscience. It demonstrates to the state how serious the consequences of its policies are. If the government changes its policies as a result of this act, so much the better. Even if it doesn't, the man who commits civil disobedience remains true both to his conscience and to the state. Here too, then, Socrates appears in the role of teacher. On the one hand, he claims the right to disobey a law on the grounds of conscience. On the other hand, he would commit this act of disobedience publicly, with no attempt to conceal it or to avoid the consequences. He accepts the right of the state to judge him for breaking its laws. Having reached this conclusion, Socrates could hardly then attempt to escape the punishment that Athens had set for him. So he awaits that punishment patiently. In making this decision, he recognizes the claims of his own principles and of the laws as well.
This is the end of side 1. Please fast forward and turn over your cassette.
The dialogue titled The Phaedo, the third in the trilogy about Socrates' last days, describes Socrates' execution itself and the conversation he had with his friends just before he died. These events are portrayed years after they occurred by Phaedo, a friend of Socrates who'd been present at the time. The setting is the same prison where Crito talked with Socrates. The ships return to Athens, and the death sentence is now to be carried out. Crito is there again, together with Phaedo and other friends of his. The group enters the prison just after Socrates' chains have been removed. His wife Xanthippe and his young son have arrived earlier, and Socrates now asks Crito to take them home. He wants to discuss with his friends for one last time the significance of what is happening. To the end, Socrates is committed to the examined life. Here he wants to reflect on death as a part of that life. Socrates begins the dialogue with a startling description of the relation between death and philosophy. He tells his friends that it's foolish to think of death as an evil. Philosophy itself is a rehearsal for dying. Why, Socrates asks, should someone devote his life to examining truth and then be afraid of that truth when he encounters it face to face?
People who really apply themselves in the right way to philosophy are directly and of their own accord preparing themselves for dying and death. If this is true, it would, of course, be absurd to be troubled when the thing comes, for which they have so long been preparing and looking forward.
Socrates' friends are puzzled by this odd description of philosophy, but they're not too perplexed to find the irony in it. So Simmias, one of the friends, replies,
"Upon my word, Socrates, you have made me laugh, though I was not at all in the mood for it. I am sure that if they heard what you said, most people would heartily agree that it was a very good hit at the philosophers to say that they are half dead already, and that they, the normal people, are quite aware that death would serve the philosophers right."
But Socrates responds that the people who say this are right for the wrong reason. In fact, they don't understand what philosophy is. They don't even know what death is. Certainly they miss the connection between them. Philosophy depends on the use of reason, and reason can be free only when it's not hindered by feelings or emotions, by the interference of the senses. In other words, the mind must be left to follow its own course, something that's unlikely as long as feelings or emotions intrude. Because of this, philosophy emphasizes the importance of separating the body from the soul, and it's that kind of dying that Socrates is urging on his friends. To show what he means here, he reminds them of certain ideals or principles that he's mentioned before. There are obvious differences between feelings and ideas, between the senses and reason. Our senses are attached to our bodies. What we learn from the senses is just as changeable as the bodies themselves. Genuine knowledge, on the other hand, doesn't change. This means that the objects of knowledge, in other words, what we know, must also be constant and fixed. It's in these terms that Socrates begins to question Simmias.
Do we say, Simmias, that there is such a thing as justice?
We do say so, certainly.
And such things as the good and the beautiful?
Of course.
And did you ever see one of them with your eyes, or any other of the body's senses?
Never.
The direction of Socrates' arguments becomes clear. We discover ideals or general principles and definitions through reason. Anything that blocks this process should be avoided. In human experience, the senses and the emotions obstruct reason, so philosophy is a practice for dying, as reason constantly distances itself from the body and its senses. And what is this distancing but a form of dying? Socrates speaks here of dying as a metaphor. His friends, however, focused on the execution, are thinking of death not metaphorically but literally. Socrates is speaking even at the end about the life of philosophy. His friends are concerned about the difference that physical death makes, even to the soul or mind. And so, on his last day, as often before, Socrates finds himself in a philosophical tug-of-war. His friends still have to be convinced that reason and the soul are indeed different from matter and body, that the mind does not have physical properties, and certainly that the mind does not have a beginning or an end. The friends believe that Socrates is speaking here about the physical existence of a soul that might continue to live after death, and they're both skeptical and fearful. They press Socrates with some of the standard objections to the idea of immortality. So, for example, Cabes argues that the soul is only a harmony of parts of the body, a harmony which disintegrates when the body does. Even if the soul is more than a harmony and exists before the body, he adds, this doesn't mean that it would survive death. For if a single soul reappeared in a number of bodies, here Cabes refers to the idea of reincarnation, which was a fairly common belief, the soul itself would sooner or later wear out or disintegrate. So Simmias objects,
A tailor makes and wears out any number of coats, but although he outlives all the others, presumably he perishes before the last one. And this does not mean that a man is inferior to a coat, or has a weaker hold on life, but still the soul may die, leaving behind its latest covering or body.
Socrates responds patiently to these objections. His friends need reassurance much more than he does. Cabes openly admits the fears they feel.
Probably even in us adults there is a little boy who has these childish terrors. You should try, Socrates, to persuade that little boy not to be afraid of death as though it were something awful.
And Socrates does indeed attempt to give them courage, appealing to their emotions and to their reason. He cautions them against becoming skeptical of all arguments just because there seem to be many conflicting ones that are plausible.
We must not let it enter our minds that there may be no validity in argument. On the contrary, we should recognize that the faults of defective arguments are in us, and we must brace ourselves and try to heal ourselves.
Does Socrates believe that the soul is immortal? Well, undoubtedly he does. But even in his last hours, he's less concerned with the soul's fate after the body physically dies. He's more concerned with the soul's activity in life. On this point, Socrates is unequivocal. There is a radical difference between mind and body, between reason and matter. This difference is even more important in life than in death, and the proof is close by. Socrates is now in prison awaiting execution, having rejected the opportunity to escape. How can that be explained, he asks.
Suppose that someone were to tell me that the reason I sit here now is that my body consists of bone and muscle, so that when the bones are raised in their sockets, the muscles slackening and tightening enable me to bend my limbs. And for this cause I sit here now.
Socrates strongly challenges this explanation.
You can be certain that these bones and muscles would have been far away by now, if it were not for my belief that it was better and more just to submit to the sentence that my city gives than to take to my heels and run.
The reason Socrates sits in prison is altogether different from the physical cause for sitting there. This is the difference between a decision of the mind and a response of the body.
A philosopher's soul will not first expect to be set free by philosophy, and then allow pleasure and pain to reduce it once more to bondage, thus taking upon itself an endless task, like Penelope when she undid her own weaving. No, this soul secures immunity from its desires by following reason and abiding always in her company, and by contemplating the true and divine.
If the mind or soul acts differently from the body, this could only be because they are different. Socrates wants to make certain his friends are persuaded of this truth, even if they don't understand it. In addition to satisfying their reason, the little boy in them has to be comforted. So he finally tells them a story, which, like so many fables, mingles fact and fiction. In this story, Socrates describes how souls are judged after they die. Those who've acted wickedly are punished. Those who've lived good lives are rewarded. Those whose lives have been mixed are both punished and rewarded. As a result, souls are cured of their wickedness. The truth in this myth, Socrates suggests, is that people are responsible for the lives they lead. Whatever circumstances they find themselves in, their power of reason enables them to decide what they will do about those circumstances. This truth applies to life. Whether there's literally also a judgment after death is a separate question, and Socrates' words here tell us something more about his method.
No reasonable man ought to insist that the facts are exactly as I have described them, but that either this, or something like it, is a true account of our souls. This, I think, is a reasonable contention, and a belief worth risking, for the risk is a noble one. We should use such accounts to inspire ourselves with confidence.
After he tells this story, time grows short, and Socrates begins to prepare himself for the executioner. Even then, after all he has said, his friends aren't entirely convinced. Their doubts come out in an odd way. "How shall we bury you?" Crito asks, and Socrates replies teasingly,
However you want. That is, if you catch me and I don't escape you. I can't persuade Crito that I am this Socrates here, who is talking to you now and marshalling all the arguments. He thinks that I am the one whom he will see presently lying dead. No, you must keep up your spirits, and say that it is only my body that you are burying. And you can bury it as you please, in whatever way you think is proper.
Soon afterwards, the jailer brings the cup of hemlock that is to be the means of execution. Socrates drinks the poison and then follows the jailer's instructions to walk up and down till he feels he has to lie down. Crito, Socrates says, we owe a cock to Asclepius, and so he again reminds his friends with his last words that his death is actually a form of healing. He asks them to make a sacrifice in his behalf to the god of healing. Phaedo, the narrator of the dialogue, then concludes his account of the scene and of Socrates.
This was the end of our comrade. A man, as we should say, of all then living, the noblest and the wisest and the most just.
It's certain that Plato rearranged his description of Socrates' last days. But Plato's portrait of ethics in action is compelling, apart from this historical issue. It is possible, we learn, to value moral principle more than life itself. This becomes clear in Socrates' life and death. In addition to Plato's description of the philosophical life in action, he also lays out for his readers a number of arguments about certain central questions of ethics. These questions themselves constitute a pattern. What do we need to learn or know in order to make ethical decisions? How can that be learned or taught? What's the relation between knowledge and moral character? What, by contrast, is the source of wrongdoing or evil? And finally, the most fundamental question, why should a man live according to ethical values? The last of these questions recurs in many of Plato's dialogues. It's usually raised by a speaker who's convinced that wrongdoing or crime pays better than pursuing justice or doing good. But the question itself needs to be questioned. It seems to demand an ethical reason for being ethical. It asks, why should I or anyone be moral? But if ethical values themselves are being questioned, it hardly seems possible to give an ethical reason to justify them. Many philosophers since Plato have concluded that there is no basis outside of ethics itself for acting morally. But for Plato, the moral life is closely tied to reason. He believes that reason's the distinguishing feature of human nature, and therefore man can know and do what is good only by applying reason itself. Indeed, by acting in accordance with reason and the good, people fulfill their true nature. It's by doing this that the command of the Delphic oracle, know thyself, will be obeyed. This reason-oriented view of human nature underlies a number of perplexing statements Plato makes about the difference between good and evil.
An evil person can never harm a good person. It is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. One should never repay evil with evil.
All of these assertions contradict common beliefs and common practice, but Plato clearly intends to do this. He was obviously aware that wrongdoing often has harsh, painful consequences for its victims. But, he asserts, one thing an evildoer can't do is to make a good person evil. If that were possible, it would be the very worst thing anyone could do to someone else. But it can't be done. Only we ourselves determine whether we will act justly or unjustly. Furthermore, the evildoer harms himself most of all, because wrongdoing goes against both reason and nature. Plato says that to act justly is the most important way in which man can live in accordance with nature. In this way, happiness can be achieved, too, since we're happy only when our natural inclinations and capacities are fully realized. So Plato repeatedly speaks out in the dialogues against those who look at the world around them and conclude that wrongdoing pays.
This alone stands steadfast, that we should be more on our guard against doing than suffering wrong, and that, before all things, a man should study not to seem, but to be good, whether in private or in public life, and that if anyone proves evil in any way, he should be chastised. Next to being good, the second best thing is to become good, and to make amends by accepting one's punishment. You may let anyone despise you as a fool and do you outrage if he wishes, yes, and you may cheerfully let him strike you with that humiliating blow, for you will suffer no harm thereby, if you really are a good and honorable man.
Plato believes that ethical actions are both reasonable and natural, but it may seem that he underestimates the powerful attraction of wrongdoing. The wrongdoer often seems to get ahead of those who act justly. Often he seems to find pleasure in his actions and their consequences. But for Plato, neither of these assumptions is convincing. He says wrongdoing brings illusory benefits. In fact, such benefits harm the receiver. The pleasure that seems to accompany wrongdoing soon becomes tyrannical. It turns into a desire for satisfaction that can never be satisfied. Here again, Plato stresses the power of reason. If people really know what the good is, they won't be able to go against that knowledge.
The lover of wisdom will himself become orderly and divine in the measure permitted to man, and a compulsion is laid upon him to practice stamping on the plastic matter of human nature, in public and private, the patterns that he envisions.
Knowledge begins with self-knowledge. Together, they provide the key to ethics for Plato. Here, as elsewhere, Plato's confidence in reason is overwhelming. He asserts that to know the good is to do the good. This means that whoever really knows what's morally right will then be impelled to do it. And the converse of this also holds. Whatever anyone does, he does because he thinks it's good. So Plato writes,
Even when we slaughter, or banish from the city, or deprive of property, we do not simply will these acts. We will the good, not what is neither good nor evil, nor what is evil. Even the worst tyrant surely does what seems good to him.
People may be mistaken in judging their own actions, but at least they think that what they're doing is right. Otherwise, Plato concludes, they wouldn't do it. How then does evil or wrongdoing happen? People do wrong, Plato suggests, not because they want to, but out of ignorance. Either they're unaware of what the good is, or they don't realize what they're doing. Maybe both.
If acting unjustly is harmful to the wrongdoer, is it not knowledge of what he is doing that would prevent this act? And does this not mean, once again, that no one voluntarily does wrong, but that all who do wrong do so against their own will?
Wrongdoing has no positive features. It's always a failure or absence. In fact, evil's not even quite real. It's a shadow of the good that might have been. People who do wrong don't act willingly or wittingly. They do so quite simply because they don't know any better. Predictably, this view of evil has consequences for Plato's conception of punishment. If a wrong were done knowingly, then punishment would be justified, either as retribution, paying back the wrongdoer, or as a deterrent, making life so painful that he won't repeat the act. But if wrongs are done because of ignorance, the wrongdoer is not really responsible for what he does. So Plato concludes his punishment should be a form of rehabilitation, educating him to recognize the true nature of the good.
The wicked man and the doer of evil is in any case unhappy. But he is more unhappy if he does not meet with justice and suffer punishment. Less unhappy if he pays the penalty and suffers punishment.
Only with this punishment and the self-knowledge it brings will the wrongdoer then become fully responsible for what he does, whether it's evil or good. Punishment then should be designed to educate, and the task here, it seems, is not very different from the more general task of leading people from ignorance to knowledge. How then can we acquire the knowledge we need to act ethically? On the one hand, if people are rational by nature, then they should also be naturally good. In Plato's view, it's reasonable to act in accordance with the good. And if people are naturally good, learning to act justly will be unnecessary. They'll already know this. On the other hand, Plato's aware that people often do act wrongly or unjustly. But the lack of knowledge that explains this also comes from inside ourselves. Nobody can give someone else the power of reason. No one can make someone else do what is wrong. Furthermore, Plato says knowledge can't simply be transferred like a message or a possession, nor can knowledge be bought or sold. In this sense, in fact, neither ethics nor anything else can be taught. This again is why Socrates wouldn't accept fees for his teaching. He didn't want people to think they could buy knowledge. Both reason and knowledge come from inside the knower. The role of the teacher, for ethics as for all other knowledge, is then only to provoke the student into teaching himself, to sting him, just as Socrates in his role as the gadfly of Athens had done in his life. Plato's so committed to this view of teaching and learning that he asks us to accept a rather fanciful explanation for it. He says, people have knowledge, all knowledge, in themselves, innately. It's born in them. But for some reason, Plato suggests, at birth this innate knowledge is forgotten. Teachers, then, are supposed to remind their students of what they already know, but have forgotten. Plato admits he's telling a tall tale when he says that innate knowledge has been forgotten. But he tells this story to justify his theory of teaching and learning, which is much more important to him. Plato's myth also recalls Socrates in his self-pronounced role of gadfly. He made people remember what they'd rather forget. In the dialogue entitled the Meno, Plato puts together the many pieces of this theory of learning, relating the theory to an analysis of ethics. The dialogue opens with a question Meno puts to Socrates.
Can you tell me, Socrates, whether virtue can be taught? Or if not, does it come by practice? Or does it come neither by practice nor by teaching? But perhaps people have it by nature, or in still some other way.
How, in other words, does a man become good or virtuous? Socrates responds characteristically by challenging Meno's assumption that he already knows what virtue is. He urges Meno to answer that question before going on to consider whether virtue can be taught or not. And Meno shows that Socrates' doubts are well-founded. He first tries to define virtue by offering a list of examples.
A man's virtue is to manage public business, to help friends, and hurt enemies. A woman's virtue is to manage the house well, and keep the stores all safe, and obey her husband.
Socrates quickly notices Meno's mistake. You can't define what something is by giving examples of it, because you need the definition before you can find the examples. Otherwise, how would you know where to look? Socrates asks Meno,
Suppose I ask you what a bee is. What is its essential nature? And you replied that bees were of many different kinds. What I want you to tell me is not that they are different, or even how they are different, but how they are all the same.
In Plato's view, Meno's made a common error. This error is evidence that general principles exist. Plato says particular examples imply that there is something common among them. The goal of all science is to determine what that common something is. This is true for all kinds of knowing. So it also applies to the understanding of ethical or moral values like justice or courage or piety. So it's crucial to discover what this group of ethical qualities have in common. But this is not easily accomplished. Meno himself points to one difficulty when he describes a dilemma that might block the way to all knowledge and learning.
How will you try to find out something, Socrates, when you have no notion at all of what it is? If you meet it by chance, how will you know this is that which you did not know?
In other words, if you know something, you don't have to learn it. If you don't know it, you won't be able to recognize it when you do learn it. According to this dilemma, learning of any sort would be impossible. Socrates responds first by telling Meno a myth he's heard. Then he gives what amounts to a practical demonstration of the myth. The myth, according to Socrates, describes the soul or mind as immortal. And if a soul is immortal and rational, it knows everything that can be known. More exactly, everything knowable is included in the soul. When the soul's born into a body, however, it forgets what it's previously known. The knowledge is still there, but the newborn infant doesn't have access to it. The infant then seems to begin anew, from the beginning. But in fact, the way it learns is by a process of recollecting or remembering what it previously knew. In this sense, learning and teaching do not provide the student with new information. They only prod him to recall what he already knows. Socrates provides an example of what he means here by giving an impromptu geometry lesson to a slave boy who belongs to Meno. He encourages the boy to answer some questions and claims that the boy finds in himself the geometric proof they eventually produce. Socrates, with his reminders, clearly asks what we would call leading questions. But he emphasizes to Meno that the boy's answers come not from Socrates or from any other external source. The answers come from the boy himself.
And no one having taught him, only asked questions, yet he will know, having got knowledge out of himself.
At this point, the dialogue with Meno shifts back to the question from which it started. What is the relation between ethics and knowledge? Plato suggests that ethical knowledge can be recovered from the self through questioning. Accordingly, it must be related to knowledge at a more general and basic level. But what is this relation? Socrates prods Meno to consider the ethical qualities that are usually valued most highly: justice, courage, temperance. Isn't it true, Socrates asks, that they all presuppose at least one thing in common: knowledge?
For example, courage. If courage does not involve intelligence, would not the boldness associated with courage turn into foolhardiness? Isn't it true that to be confident without reason does a man harm, whereas reasoned confidence helps him?
Plato makes a common-sense point. It'd be foolish never to back away from a situation. In some circumstances, to back away, even to run away, is the prudent, the right thing to do. A genuinely courageous man will recognize this. Courage, then, consists in knowing what to fear and what not to fear, and then acting on that knowledge. The same argument applies to all other moral virtues. Knowledge also has a central role in each. And if virtue presupposes knowledge, then, Plato seems to conclude, virtue can be taught. Even the most forgetful soul should be able to remember virtue, and this would be true for everybody. No one is unteachable. The discussion between Socrates and Meno, however, doesn't end with this conclusion. Socrates is still not convinced that Meno fully understands what it means to teach somebody something. He proves this to the reader and to Meno by seeming to contradict his own first answer, that virtue can be taught. Then Socrates watches how Meno reacts. Plato now argues for what seems to be the opposite conclusion from his earlier position. If virtue is knowledge and can be taught, he challenges Meno, surely there ought to be people who teach it. But in fact, as we look around Athens, we don't find such teachers. Indeed, there are people who claim to teach ethics, but they don't really do this. Their students frequently turn out badly. Indeed, even the children of good parents often turn out to be unjust. It seems obvious if anyone would want to instill ethical values, parents would want to instill them in their children. Contrary to the first conclusion, then, common perception tells us that virtue's not, in fact, taught. It does not seem to be knowledge, and Socrates questions Meno on this point.
Can you name any other subject in which the professed teachers are not only not recognized as teachers of others, but are thought to have no understanding of it themselves, and to be no good at the very subject they profess to teach? When people are so confused about a subject, can you say that they are in a true sense teachers?
With this question, the dialogue draws to an abrupt close. Meno, and we as well, are left hanging. We are left to ponder the apparent contradiction that Plato seems to have asserted. Virtue both can and cannot be taught. Virtue both is and is not knowledge. But Plato's left a clue in his text. A clue which Meno himself in the dialogue misses. In the first part of their discussion, Socrates and Meno consider the relation between ethics and knowledge in general. They don't discuss the specific knowledge that's required to be good or just. When Socrates later asserts that there are no teachers of ethics, however, he's referring specifically to the people who pass for teachers in Athens. That they are not true teachers doesn't mean that there could not be others who are. Socrates himself has taught geometry to the slave boy. In the same way, he's taught ethics to the Athenians, by his own example and by questioning. For Plato's audience here, the message is clear. Ethics is a form of knowledge, and it can be taught. But we must first understand what knowledge is. We must genuinely understand what it means to teach and to learn. It's easy to be mistaken about both knowledge and learning. Socrates has shown Meno and us how at least some of our common mistakes can be avoided.
This is the end of tape number 1 on Plato. The presentation is continued on tape 2. This is tape number 2 on Plato.
For Plato, the connections among philosophical questions are more basic and more important than their differences. These connections are especially noticeable in the relation between Plato's view of ethics and his political theory. Here we find a connection between the life of the individual, which ethics is concerned with, and the life of society, or the state, which is the subject of political theory. For Plato, in fact, the state is a more fundamental entity than the individual, not because the state is larger or more powerful, but because human existence is itself essentially social. A person who is not part of a social or political structure would have a hard time surviving at all. Even if the lone individual did survive physically, he'd not yet be human. Plato believes that to be human, one must be part of a society. From this relation, people draw their ways of thinking and their values, beginning with the very language they depend on. In this sense, Plato holds that the individual is subservient to society or the state, not the other way around. This conception of the relation between the individual and the state is the basis for the best known of all Plato's dialogues, the Republic. The Republic is organized around the question, what is justice? Typically, Plato edges up to this question obliquely from the question of whether it is more rewarding and pleasurable to be just than to be unjust. Like many Athenians at the time, and like many people at all times, several of the characters in the beginning of Plato's Republic believe that acting justly does not pay. In any event, they believe acting justly is not the way of the world. So, for example, Thrasymachus challenges Socrates.
You think that shepherds are considering the good of their sheep and cattle. And by the same token, you seem to suppose that the rulers in our cities think of something more than the sources of their own profit. But the truth is just the other way round. You should look at the matter in this way, my simple-minded Socrates, that the just man always comes out at a disadvantage in his relation with the unjust.
Plato takes this challenge seriously, but in order to prove that acting justly is not only right, but also more practical, Plato pushes the issue back a step to the question of what justice is. That's the question he wants to consider anyway. We have to answer this question, he asserts, before we can determine the consequences of either justice or injustice. And one way to find the answer is to inquire about justice not in the life of the individual, but, as he says, writ large, at the level of the state.
Since there is a justice of one man, and also a justice of an entire city, then perhaps there would be more justice in the larger object, and it would be easier to apprehend there. Accordingly, let us look for this quality in states, and only then examine it also in the individual, looking for the likeness of the greater in the form of the less.
By this indirect route, Plato formulates the issues to be addressed in the dialogue. What is the nature of the just or ideal state? What role do individual citizens have in that state? Who should govern? What are their qualifications? How will this ideal state come into existence? These are obviously very broad questions. Plato's response to them touches on a variety of topics. So Plato's account of the state includes a theory of education, how children are to be raised in the ideal society, and an analysis of literature and art, which should be part of that education. Plato includes as well a theory of human nature and psychology, why people act as they do. And finally, he presents his theory of knowledge and a view of his metaphysics. If we're to know what the ideal state is, we have to understand also what knowledge itself is. For Plato, then, all these topics are not merely relevant, they are necessary. This assertion is one of the most striking claims of the Republic. Plato, like many later writers, assumes that governments were first formed in response to certain physical needs. In order to provide food and shelter, societies arrive at a division of labor. Then they create a system of laws and the means for enforcing those laws in order to support the organization of the state. But a society or state that goes no further than this, Plato suggests, would not satisfy all the needs of its citizens. They wouldn't realize any potential beyond their physical, biological requirements.
It is not merely the origin of a city that we need to consider, but a city that will no longer be confined to necessities. We must then proceed to fill out its bulk with a multitude of things that exceed the requirements of necessity. For example, with the poets and musicians, with the soldiers, and with those who are to govern.
In a society concerned only with material needs, there would be no life of the mind. There would be no goal for living other than to survive physically. Certainly there would be no place for the ideals of ethics or political justice. But this can be changed. The state, Plato believes, ought to secure not only the physical life of its citizens, but also their social and human needs, the needs of the spirit or mind. It's difficult, of course, to know exactly what these needs are, but it's essential to speculate about them if we're to imagine what an ideal state might be. Since Plato wrote the Republic, many other writers have also produced versions of an ideal or utopian society. The term utopia itself comes from Thomas More's 17th century description of his ideal society. More used the Greek term utopia, which means nowhere, to describe an ideal state that does not yet or may never exist. The state that Plato describes in the Republic remains the best known, if not the most admired, of the many utopias that philosophers have conjured up. It's been attacked almost as often as it's been praised. So, for example, one recent critic, Terence Irwin, concludes,
Plato's attitude to democracy began a tradition of philosophical hostility or indifference. He wants to replace the dominance of force, manipulation, propaganda, and ignorance with the results of rational and objective inquiry. But to agree with him about this is not to admire his ideal state.
The most extreme charge against the Republic, that in the end it amounts to no more than a fascist or totalitarian state, would, if valid, be serious indeed. It's important, then, to follow the development of the dialogue as Plato presents it. Only then can we understand why a thinker of Plato's stature would conceive of his Republic as an ideal form of government. Plato's conception of the ideal state is based on a distinction that's not political at all. He emphasizes in the Republic, as elsewhere, that knowledge is fundamentally different from opinions or beliefs that often pass as knowledge.
Beliefs are not in the habit of staying put for long, but run away from a person's soul. So they are not worth much until one ties them down by reasoning. And this is why knowledge is more valuable even than true belief.
Plato draws this distinction from everyday experience, from common sense. We usually just take for granted that if we need a certain kind of work done, we'll turn to someone who we believe has the training and knowledge to do the job. We insist on trained professionals in medicine and science. This would also be true in sailing a ship, training horses, two of Plato's favorite examples. Some people are more expert in doing these things than others. They have the know-how to do them better than others who lack knowledge or experience. It seems obvious to Plato that this same rule should hold true for governing a state. In other words, the rulers of a state ought to have the necessary training and knowledge to do their job. Not everybody has this knowledge. More importantly, Plato concludes, not everybody has the capacity or talent even to acquire this knowledge. Differences in natural ability, according to Plato, must be taken into account in organizing a state, if indeed the state is to function well and justly. Accordingly, Plato divides the inhabitants of his ideal republic into 3 groups or classes. These classes correspond approximately to people's different abilities. He believes the classes are also necessary for the state to provide for the different kinds of work it requires. First, there will be a class of artisans or producers, the workers. A second class is made up of auxiliaries or administrators, who will also serve as soldiers. The third class is made up of the governors or guardians, who have the knowledge and training required to make just laws and political decisions. Assigning people to these groups will be based not on birth or social status, but on ability. Initially, all children in the state begin their education together. At a certain point in their education, the children are judged in terms of their potential. Then they're assigned to a particular class, the one in which they will remain for the rest of their lives. Plato is vague about how this all-important decision will be made, but he assumes that there will be an accurate and fair way to do it. Since the republic itself is an ideal, he imagines also that there will be an ideal solution to its practical problems. Plato's main interest, of course, is with the class of the guardians or rulers. It is they, after all, who will decide on the laws and policies of the state. To be certain that the guardians are qualified for this role, they must undergo a rigorous education. This begins in infancy and goes on continuously until only after many years the guardians take up their responsibilities as rulers.
Only by seeing how we are to bring up and to educate these people will we advance toward discerning what is the object of our entire inquiry, the origin of justice and injustice in a state.
Plato describes this process of education in some detail. Instruction begins first by training the senses and the body. Music and gymnastics convey the first lessons. But this music, and the arts more generally, must be only a particular kind. Plato believed that all art is representational, that it stands for or expresses certain attitudes or values. Since children imitate what they see or hear, it's important that their music and their stories should represent positive values, like courage, temperance, and piety. Children exposed to these values will imitate them in their own lives. This means, then, that children should not be allowed to see or hear many other things, since if they did, they would imitate those also. Especially literature, Plato believes, has to be severely censored because writers so often depict weak characters and harmful emotions.
Both poets and writers of prose speak wrongly about men in matters of greatest moment, saying that there are many examples of men who are unjust but happy, and that just men are wretched, and that there is profit in injustice if it be concealed. I presume that we shall forbid them to say this sort of thing, and command them to sing and fable the opposite.
Plato is suspicious of poetry and fiction in general, not only in the education of the young. His censorship of the arts in the Republic thus extends to all ages. He sees the arts which express and evoke emotion as a threat to reason. Many later philosophers in the rationalist tradition, like Spinoza and Descartes, would follow Plato in this belief. So the guardians begin their education with gymnastics and the heavily censored arts. The progression after this is long, moving steadily in the direction of increasing abstractness and difficulty, to mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. At the age of 30, the guardians-to-be begin a 5-year-long study of dialectic, or philosophy. Next, the potential guardians serve a 15-year apprenticeship during which they hold various administrative offices. And finally, at the age of 50, they achieve the status of guardians. These people are then supposed to know what justice is for the state, because they've achieved justice within themselves.
Justice means that a person must not allow the impulses in his soul to interfere and meddle with one another, but that having attained self-mastery within himself, he should then, and only then, turn to practice in political action.
Plato holds that not only the guardians, but also all the other people in the state, in order to achieve justice, must be assigned to the classes for which they are suited. There are 2 principal reasons for this. First, everyone in an ideal state ought to be doing the work for which he's best suited. Whatever their work, people in jobs for which they're not qualified or which they don't want will do these jobs badly. In Plato's view, this combination of discontent and incompetence would disrupt the ideal balance of a just state. He embraces this first and crucial principle, however, without considering the serious question of how to decide who is best suited for what work. Plato believes that the assignment to classes is also necessary for a second reason, that in their positions the guardians or rulers will have genuine knowledge, understanding exactly what the needs and possibilities of a just society are. This is, after all, what their role in the ideal state requires. They become rulers only once this requirement has been met. In a number of the proposals mentioned so far, Plato assumes without argument that people differ naturally in their abilities. He also assumes that these abilities are relevant to governing a state. He's aware of many of the objections that might be raised against these views, and he responds to them at least in part. So, for example, there's the question of deciding exactly how the members of the guardian class are to be chosen. Who decides? On what basis? Here Plato's answer mainly repeats and insists on the goal to be achieved. The guardians must be chosen on the basis of their ability to do their work, that is, to govern justly. Initially, everyone's eligible. And here, in fact, Plato takes a step that was quite radical for his time. He includes women as well as men among those who are eligible to rule. The only condition, again, is that a potential guardian should be qualified.
Then there is no pursuit of the administrators of a state that belongs to a woman because she is a woman, or to a man because he is a man. But the natural capacities are distributed alike among both creatures, and women naturally share in all pursuits. For the production of a female guardian, then, our education will not be one thing for men and another for women, especially since the nature which we hand over to it is the same.
There are, of course, other problems to be faced. Plato tries to make certain, for example, that people will not be attracted to the role of guardians in order to gain power, or because of its potential material rewards. To ensure this, the guardians are forbidden to own property. If they had private belongings, that would be an incentive for them to follow their own interests, not those of the community. They're not even allowed to enjoy the usual pleasure of family life. Childbearing is to be arranged by the state, even to the details of matchmaking. Plato was an early believer in eugenics, the doctrine that children should be bred in order to produce the greatest amount of talent and intelligence. The children who are born to guardians, moreover, are supposed to accept all guardians equally as their parents. Yet even here, Plato tries to avoid the possibility of favoritism. We might expect that the members of all the classes, the guardians, the artisans, and the auxiliaries, might object that there's little incentive for them to accept their assigned roles in this highly regulated state. So one of the characters in the Republic, Adeimantus, has this to say.
What will be your defense, Socrates, if anyone objects that you are not making these men very happy, and that through their own fault? For the city really belongs to them, and yet they get no enjoyment out of it, as ordinary men do, by owning lands and building fine big houses and providing them with suitable furniture, and winning the favor of the gods by private sacrifices, and entertaining guests, and enjoying all those possessions of gold and silver that is customary for those who are expecting to be happy.
Plato answers this objection by stressing that the guardians, because they are rational, will recognize the importance of their role in the state. As a result of their education and the way they're required to live, they should not put undue value on material goods. But to ensure this, and also to ensure that the other citizens accept their roles, Plato refers here, once again, to a myth. His phrase, a noble lie, which is to be told to all the citizens of the Republic. While being created, this story goes, some people have been mixed with gold, some with silver, some with the baser metals of tin and lead. Nature, then, is responsible for the different positions they have in the state, for the different lives they're to lead there. With this story as a disguise for the truth, Plato believes, the citizens of the state will accept the roles given them. Here, just as with the other myths that Plato relates in the dialogues, the kernel of the myth is something that Plato believes is literally true, that there are natural differences in ability among people. Those differences, he holds, are quite fundamental in determining what people should do with their lives. But what happens to justice in this arrangement? The Republic as a whole is to be constructed around the ideal of justice. And Plato now points out that justice is not something in addition to all these other arrangements. He writes,
Now is the time for us, like huntsmen, to surround the animal's hiding place, and to keep watch, so that justice may not slip through and get away from us and vanish from our sight.
According to Plato, when all the classes in a society are doing what they're qualified to do and doing it well, then the state functions harmoniously, or justly. Similarly, everyone has different impulses in his soul, and when they are in equilibrium, the individual is just. In this way, there's a direct connection between justice in the state and justice in the individual, a claim that Plato had assumed at the very beginning of the Republic. From our world of 20th century democracy, Plato's version of utopia involves certain obvious difficulties. The Republic constantly subordinates the good of the individual to the good of the state, allowing little, if any, room for self-determination. To be sure, in Plato's view, this is done for the good of the individual as well as for the good of the state, but this is a considerable restriction on the individual. It's fair to say, in fact, that Plato does not introduce a conception of individual rights at all. This by itself might make Plato's Republic seem much less than an ideal state. There is, however, one crucial feature in Plato's account that distinguishes his Republic from the varieties of totalitarianism experienced in the 20th century, tyrannies to which the Republic is sometimes compared. Plato repeatedly insists that those who govern must truly be qualified by ability and by education. They govern not because they have seized power, but because they have the wisdom required for solving the problems that any state encounters. This is the ideal, and if they don't have such wisdom, they would not be in power. This, at least, is Plato's stipulation, and he insistently reminds us that the alternative is that government should be in the hands of people who gain power either by guile, deceiving the people whom they rule, or by physical force. He compares the true guardian to the captain of a ship. What would happen, he asks, if the crew did not believe that their leader should be the captain?
Conceive the sailors to be wrangling with one another for control of the helm, each claiming that it is his right to steer, though he has never learned the art and cannot point out his teacher or any time when he studied it. And, what is more, they affirm that it cannot be taught at all, but they are ready to make mincemeat of anyone who says that it can be taught. And, meanwhile, they are always clustered about the captain, importuning him, and sticking at nothing to turn the helm over to them. And sometimes, if they fail, and others get his ear, they put the others to death, or cast them out from the ship. And then, after binding or drugging the worthy captain, they take command of the ship and consume its stores. And, if that were not enough, they praise and celebrate as a navigator, a pilot, a master of shipcraft, the man who is most cunning to lend a hand in persuading the captain to let them rule, while the man who lacks this craft they condemn as useless.
Some critics believe that Plato's description of the faults of democracy would be convincing only if he proposed a practical alternative. He might be convincing, for example, if we could be certain that the people who gain power are indeed those who are best qualified. But have most political leaders achieved the status of guardians? Can such an ideal, or the ideal of the Republic as a whole, really be realized? Plato recognizes the practical difficulties that stand in the way of this, but in his view, even these do not diminish the importance of his ideal.
What we sought was a model to show us what justice was. We were not trying to show that the thing is possible. Take a painter now. If he should paint a pattern of the ideally beautiful man, but he could not prove that such a man is possible, do you think he would be the worse painter for that?
In other words, ideals are important, whether or not they can be fully realized. The crucial question is whether they are indeed ideals. Even if we accepted everything Plato has so far claimed about the Republic, we would still not know exactly what equips the guardians for their role. What is the knowledge or wisdom they require? To answer this question, Plato feels obliged to introduce us to his general theory of knowledge, a theory which applies not only to politics, but wherever knowledge is required for making judgments or decisions. Plato's theory is based first on the distinction between genuine knowledge and sense experience, between knowledge and the opinions or beliefs that often pass themselves off as knowledge. In one of the most famous passages of the Republic, Plato describes the contrast between knowledge and other forms of experience through the image of a divided line, a vertical line that he then cuts into 4 sections. The major distinction in the divided line is between knowledge and opinion.
There are these 2 entities. One of them is sovereign over the intelligible order, and the other over the world of the physical eye. There are then these 2 types, the visible and the intelligible.
Opinion, he suggests, is produced by the senses and the imagination, both of which leave the way open to errors and false beliefs. The least accurate form of opinion is based on phantasms and the images of dreams. Very little can be known from this source. Sense experience is a step above dreaming or phantasms, but sense experience also fails to yield genuine knowledge. Our senses frequently make mistakes. Even when we check up on them, we still may be mistaken because we usually check them with the senses themselves. The upper part of Plato's divided line represents knowledge in contrast to opinion. Unlike opinion, knowledge achieves certainty, although here too there are different kinds. One kind of certainty Plato assigns to mathematics. Mathematics produces certainty, however, only on the basis of assumptions or axioms that are themselves unproven. A second kind of knowledge, the highest level of knowledge, is reached through reason. Reason grasps those principles of experience which don't require any assumptions, apart from what the principles themselves provide. Plato gives these principles the special name of forms, and from these forms, he claims, both reality and knowledge are constituted. The ideal of justice that Plato hopes to define in the Republic is an example of a form. This ideal is objective, unchanging, independent of any particular historical setting. Much has been written about Plato's theory of forms. Indeed, it's the most famous of all his doctrines, the one most commonly associated with his name. But the questions that he himself hoped to answer by the theory of forms still remain in the aftermath of that theory. What exactly are the forms? What evidence is there that they exist? If they do exist, how can we come to know them? Plato answers all these questions beginning from the common experience of everyday life. People gain their first impression of justice or injustice from ordinary experience. This experience includes the ways they're treated by other people or the ways in which they see other people act towards one another. But our judgments of these individual experiences don't occur as individually or separately as the events themselves. So, for example, when we praise people or specific actions as just or good, Plato claims we're judging them by a single, common standard of justice or goodness that we bring to bear. But we can do this only if such a standard exists independently of the instances themselves. That is, if we can reapply the standard when new occasions arise. Plato holds,
a form is always one and the same. Particular things that have the property of a form obtain it by participating in or mingling with the form.
This holds true for all the qualities of which there are forms. For example, beauty is a form that is always one and the same.
If someone tells me that the reason why a given object is beautiful is that it has a gorgeous color or shape or any other such quality, I disregard all these other explanations. I cling simply and straightforwardly to the explanation that the one thing that makes the object beautiful is the presence in it or in association with it of absolute beauty. Beauty in itself.
For Plato, similar reasons imply the existence of justice and the other forms that are necessary for ethical judgment. For example, courage, piety, or temperance. The forms are never seen physically. They can only be known or thought. And yet, in Plato's conception, they are more real than objects that are seen or sensed. The values they name are, for him, objective and real. To be sure, logical consistency requires that similar forms should be admitted to exist for other qualities or objects as well. Plato says that forms do exist for everything, including those things which, like colors, may seem less important than ethical qualities. Thus there is, in effect, a full world of forms, a world on which the other world of common experience is based. Plato holds that the world of forms is permanent and real. The world of common experience is constantly changing and occasional, and to this extent, common experiences are unreal. Any particular form, then, is more fundamental than the many particular sensible objects of which it is the form. The form could and often does exist without them, but not the other way around. One of Plato's most instructive descriptions of a form appears in the Republic in his account of the form of bedness. The existence of this unlikely principle, the form of the real bed, follows from the same line of reasoning that leads Plato to speak of forms elsewhere. The carpenter, he reminds us, makes a bed based on his conception of what a bed is. This conception, however, is more than only an idea in the carpenter's mind. It also reflects a structure or pattern that extends beyond him or any other carpenter.
The craftsman who produces a bed does so by fixing his eyes on the idea or form. And surely no craftsman makes the idea or form itself.
Indeed, all the beds, past, present, or future, share certain objective properties, that is, properties which exist apart from any particular person's conception of them. Otherwise, there would be no common recognition of beds as beds. Bedness, then, is the form that enables, even causes, individual beds to be beds. To be sure, there are many different kinds and shapes of beds, but nonetheless there's only one form or common principle that they all share. Plato explains this in the same way that he explains why there are forms at all.
If there were two forms of bedness, there would have to be another one of which the two would then possess the form or idea. And that would be the bed that really is, in and of itself, and not the other two.
Whether or not particular beds are different from each other in shape or material, they still retain the common features that make them beds. The craftsman who builds them imitates the form of bedness in order to make a bed that can be slept in. Yet the form itself can't be slept in, any more than can any other principle or definition. In this sense, the bed to be slept in is less real than the form of the bed. Why? Because the bed to be slept in could not exist without the form, but the form can exist without a physical example of it. By the same token, an artist who makes a painting of a bed produces an imitation of an imitation, a bed that can be seen but is not even slept in. This is another reason for Plato's repeated attacks on art and the artists. In their work, the painters and poets move further and further away from the world of forms. They are more removed from it than the world of sense experience.
The arts of imitation are far removed from truth. For it is phantoms, not realities that they produce, only their semblance or appearance. If the artist were able to make the real thing, it is unlikely that he would devote himself to the imitation of them.
In the same way that particular beds are evidence for the form of bedness, instances of courage suggest a general form of courage. Instances of temperance and piety demonstrate that these forms exist. In instances of justice, tell us that there is a general form of justice. The theory of forms, then, is at the center of Plato's thinking about the ideal state and the nature of justice. The forms also are central to Plato's concept of reality more generally. So Plato holds that in order to be just, the state and its rulers must have access to the form of the good on which justice itself is based.
The form of the good is the cause of knowledge and truth, the highest of the forms, which, acting like the sun, illuminates all the others.
As we've seen, the Republic begins by questioning what role justice has in the life of the individual. It asks, for example, whether the just man is happier than the unjust man. To answer this, Plato turns to the question of what justice is in the state, since justice appears in the state on a larger scale than it does in the individual. But all these steps presuppose that there is such a thing as justice, and that human understanding can grasp it. In this way, the dialogue shows that thinking about the ideal state depends not only on evidence about laws and government, it also involves quite general questions about the nature of knowledge and reality. Plato repeatedly asserts that justice involves or presupposes knowledge. For justice to exist, knowledge must exist. This also explains why the rulers of the ideal republic have to know not only the form of justice, but all the other forms to which the form of justice is related. In a significant allegory on the Republic, Plato describes a cave in which a number of men are held prisoner. The men are tied up in such a way that they can only look straight ahead. All they can see, then, are shadows projected on the wall of the cave. Since the prisoners never see anything but these shadows, it's natural for them to think that the shadows on the wall are real. Nothing else exists for them. But suddenly, then, one of the prisoners is freed and makes his way out of the cave, emerging into the sunlight. The change is difficult for the freed man, and at first he refuses to look at the new world around him.
If he were compelled to look at the light itself, would not that pain his eyes? And would he not turn away and flee to those things which he is able to discern in the shadows, and regard them as more clear and more exact than the objects illuminated by the sun?
Gradually, however, the freed prisoner recognizes that the images he'd seen in the cave wall were indeed only shadows of the world that he now sees around him so clearly. Reluctantly, he returns to the cave and tells the other prisoners about his discovery, but they refuse to believe him. They know only the world of shadows. They have no reason to doubt that this world is real. In fact, they resent the returning prisoner and the news he brings about another reality. He wants them to give up their traditional beliefs. They might even kill him, Plato suggests, reminding us of what the Athenians did to Socrates when he suggested that they did not have the knowledge they thought they did. In this allegory, Plato says, the role of the escaped prisoner is the role of the philosopher.
This image we must apply as a whole to all that has been said, comparing the region revealed by sight with the habitation of the prison. And if you assume that the ascent from the cave and the contemplation of the things outside it is the mind's ascent to the realm of reason, you will not miss my own interpretation.
The philosopher's task is to demonstrate to others that there is a difference between the world of shadows and the real world. To reveal that difference is the constant challenge to reason and to the philosopher, as he attempts to teach others. This challenge applies to our thinking about politics and the state. Indeed, it applies to all thinking.
This is the end of Side 1. Please fast forward and turn
Plato,
over your
then,
cassette.
political decisions and policies are philosophical at their core. There can be no ideal state or just life without understanding the principles of political philosophy. And understanding these principles requires us also to understand what knowledge itself is. This need extends not only to politics, but much further. Everything that matters in human decisions or judgments depends on the difference between truth and falsity, between knowledge and ignorance. The need for making these distinctions is even more urgent because, as Plato insists, knowledge is not related only to an individual or a group. For Plato, the difference between what is true and what is false is more than a matter of subjective opinion. Plato criticizes this subjective or relativist view of knowledge and values. This view had been made popular in Athens by the Sophists, a group of itinerant teachers. The Sophists proposed to replace the certainties of religious and social traditions by a new conception of values and knowledge. According to this concept, truth and values are no more than human creations. They are not objective or natural. Certainly they're not fixed and permanent, as Plato held. The Sophists said these things could change in any way people might decide. This was a new and startling idea for a society in which tradition was the basis for most beliefs. The Sophists are sometimes looked back at almost as revolutionaries. They were, in effect, the first humanists. They believed in the power of man to construct his own world, his own institutions, his own commitments. Plato recognized the importance of their challenge, but the challenge was a threat that needed to be opposed. For Plato, the belief that humans invent values and knowledge is both practically harmful and philosophically indefensible. The major themes of Plato's thought, including the theory of forms and his ideal republic, reflect his opposition to the Sophists. Protagoras, the most famous of them, summarized their position memorably.
Man is the measure of all things, of those things that are, that they are. and of those things that are not, that they are not.
Against this doctrine, Plato argues that knowledge and values are objective, that they are fixed independently of the knower. For Plato, knowledge and values are real in themselves. It's important to understand exactly what's entailed in the sophist's concept of knowledge, because Plato's reaction against it is the basis of his own thinking. This dispute is in fact the focus of another of Plato's dialogues, the Theaetetus, named after a figure in the dialogue with whom Socrates converses. The dialogue opens, as so many of them do, with a question. What is knowledge? Socrates asks Theaetetus. And Theaetetus, like Meno, responds not with a definition, but with several examples.
I think that all the things one can learn are knowledge. Geometry and all the sciences, and then there are the crafts of the cobbler and other workmen. Each and all of these are knowledge, and nothing else.
Socrates predictably answers that he's searching not for examples, but for a definition. He chides Theaetetus.
Suppose we were asked about some obvious common thing, for instance, what clay is. It would be absurd to answer potter's clay, and oven maker's clay, and brickmaker's clay.
Theaetetus quickly catches the spirit of Socrates' questioning, so quickly, in fact, that he wonders at Socrates' power as a teacher in contrast to his own pain as a student. This gives Socrates another chance to describe himself as a teacher. This time, he compares a teacher and a midwife.
My art of midwifery is in general like that of the midwives who deliver children. The only difference is that my patients are men, not women. And my concern is not with the body, but with the soul that is in travail of birth. And the highest point of my art is the power to prove by every test whether the offspring of a young man's thought is a false phantom or one that is full of life and truth. Heaven constrains me to serve as a midwife, but has debarred me from giving birth. So of myself I have no sort of wisdom, nor has any discovery ever been born of me.
So Plato reminds us that a student must discover in himself the knowledge he seeks. Theaetetus then tries once more to answer Socrates' question.
Well, Socrates, with such encouragement from a person like you, it would be a shame not to say what one can. It seems to me, then, that one who knows something is perceiving the thing he knows. So far as I can see at present, knowledge is nothing but perception.
When Theaetetus says that knowledge seems to be perception, he's already applying his own definition. Socrates quickly associates what Theaetetus both says and does with Protagoras' claim that man is the measure of all things. Theaetetus has restated Protagoras' belief that truth is determined by the way it seems or appears to each individual. Now the chase is on. Socrates criticizes Protagoras along several tracks. The main direction of his criticism is what's known as a reductio ad absurdum argument, showing that the consequences of a statement or a position lead to absurdity. For example, Socrates contends that if Protagoras were correct in saying that each man is the measure of all things, then no one is wiser than anyone else about anything. This would mean that a layman's opinion would be as sound as a physician's about treating an illness. Someone with no special knowledge at all should have as much to say as the wine grower about planning his harvest. He should be as expert about composing music as the musician. In fact, Socrates points out, if Protagoras is correct, no one can ever be mistaken about anything.
Aren't you surprised, Theaetetus, that all of a sudden you should turn out to be as wise as any other man, or any god? Must we not rather suppose that Protagoras speaks in this way to flatter the ears of the public?
If everyone's statements are equally correct, even when two people contradict each other, they must both be right. In fact, if many people say that Protagoras is mistaken when he claims that man is the measure of all things, their statement that he's mistaken would be correct. In fact, if the majority rules, then their view must be more correct than Protagoras' original statement.
Protagoras, admitting as he does that everybody's opinion is true, must acknowledge the truth of his opponent's belief about his own belief where they think he is wrong.
But would Protagoras take a vote to find out whether man is or is not the measure of all things? Socrates wonders. It's something of a mystery, in fact, why Protagoras bothered to say that man is the measure of all things at all. He could just as well say that the baboon or the pig was the measure. They too, after all, are capable of perception. If Protagoras puts people ahead of animals, he must assume that people have knowledge beyond the perception that they share in common with animals. And Protagoras can't say this without contradicting himself. Then, too, there's the irony we see when Protagoras poses as a teacher and recruits students. How can he do this if indeed everyone's opinions are equal?
If no one is entitled to say whether what another thinks is true or false, where is the wisdom of Protagoras to justify his setting up to teach others and to be handsomely paid for it? And where is our need to go and sit at his feet when each of us is himself the measure of his own wisdom?
Socrates had evidently been waiting a long time to launch this attack, but he contends that his attack is fair to Protagoras' doctrine itself. In one way, of course, Protagoras' claim makes sense. If someone says he feels a certain way, cold or warm, that statement can't be disputed. No one else can judge better than he what he feels. But to say that all claims of knowledge are like this statement leads to absurdity, according to Socrates. Socrates insists to Theaetetus that if knowledge is merely perception, it doesn't matter what the perceived object is. Indeed, objects wouldn't be objects at all in the ordinary sense of that word. They would be changing continuously into their opposites, since they would have to agree with both of the contradictory views that different people held of them.
There would be nothing constant here. A thing would not be white, but would have to be always changing into another color. We could not even give it the name of one color rather than another. And this is no more seeing a color than not seeing it.
These impossible consequences, Socrates argues, prove that Protagoras' theory and Theaetetus' own first definition of knowledge are inadequate. Knowledge may begin with perception, but it's not limited to perception. Man is undoubtedly the measure of some things, but of other things, including the most important ones, he is not. There is also one final reason in Plato's view for holding that knowledge is more than perception. Even when we speak about perception or sense experience, we say what we see or hear through the senses, not only with them. How otherwise would we coordinate the senses? How could we recognize that an object we see is indeed the same object that we touch or taste? Socrates says there must be something more at work here than the senses themselves.
Take the sound and color of a particular thing, Theaetetus. Have you not a thought which might include them both, which tells you that they belong to the same thing? Through what organ do you think all this about them? What is common to both cannot itself come to you by hearing or by sight alone, but only by a mind, or whatever it is to be called.
That mind, of course, would not be perceiving, but thinking. Socrates believes Protagoras couldn't make this distinction without contradicting himself. Theaetetus is persuaded by Socrates that whatever it is, knowledge is not merely perception. He then goes on to propose two further possibilities. The first of these is that knowledge is true opinion, a possibility that Socrates quickly addresses with a vivid analogy.
Let us suppose that every mind is a kind of aviary, stocked with birds of every sort, which stand for pieces of knowledge. When we are babies, the aviary is empty. Whenever a person acquires any piece of knowledge and puts it in the aviary, we say he has learned the things of which this is the knowledge.
But what's missing from this birdhouse is a way to explain how we are able to pick out the particular bird we want, when we want it. What is that knowledge? And so the second hypothesis, although advancing beyond the first, also fails, soon to be followed by a third and final one. In this sense, the dialogue as a whole doesn't answer the question from which it sets out. Neither Theaetetus nor the reader learns what knowledge is, but they will both have learned something about what knowledge is not, and this clearly is an important step forward for learning about anything, including knowledge. The distinction between perception and knowledge is especially crucial here. Only by distinguishing between perception and knowledge can we separate the person who has knowledge from the object of knowledge, between the knower and the known. Once this distinction is clear, the way is open also for understanding the differences between belief and knowledge, between appearance and reality. All the distinctions that are needed, Plato claims, to prove the validity of his theory of forms. We can now clarify how Socrates' arguments in the Theaetetus are related to the theory of forms as it appears in the Republic. The theory of forms fundamentally distinguishes between perception and knowledge, and it makes two basic claims related to that distinction. The first of these claims is that whatever is known must be apprehended by more than the senses. Second, the object known has to be more than just a stimulus for the senses. What knowledge is about must be independent of the knower. It must be objective. It must be real. Plato concludes from this starting point that only something like reason or the mind can know, and what the mind knows must itself be rational or intelligible. Even ordinary experience tells us what the objects of true knowledge are. We make sense of the jumble of things and of the qualities we encounter in everyday life by finding patterns or common features among them. These patterns have general names: courage, or justice, or bed. But general names would make sense only if reality itself is organized in the way that they describe. These general terms, again, correspond to the forms, the universal and objective standards which exist independently of any particular instances. The forms also are independent of space and time, in the same way that a definition exists outside the pages of any particular dictionary, and also apart from all dictionaries. The forms are necessary, according to Plato, if we're to make sense of the plurality and the confusion of the apparent world. And he concludes, we do make sense of it. To be sure, the theory of forms is itself open to a variety of objections. Plato's the first to mention many of them. In the dialogues named the Sophist and the Parmenides, Plato describes the most fundamental problems. Exactly what is the relation between the universal forms and particular things? What's the relation of the forms to each other? Do the forms themselves have the same qualities of which they are forms? For example, is redness red, or courage courageous? Furthermore, do forms exist for all things and properties, including those which can hardly be perfect, like mud or errors? These aren't merely quibbles. If the forms do exist, we should be able to describe their relations to each other, to what they are not, and most of all, to themselves. Plato proposes answers to most of these questions, although even he's not entirely satisfied with those answers. Many of the philosophers who followed him find them even more unsatisfactory. Notwithstanding, Plato remains firm in his commitment to the theory of forms, if only because he foresees even greater difficulties in trying to understand experience without them. So in this dialogue, we hear Socrates expressing his agreement with the older philosopher Parmenides.
If, in view of all these difficulties, and others like them, a man refuses to admit that forms of things exist, or to distinguish a definite form in every case, he will have nothing on which to fix his thought, so long as he will not allow that each thing has a character that is always the same. In so doing, he will completely destroy the significance of all discourse.
In committing himself to the theory of forms, then, Plato contends that genuine knowledge, as opposed to mere opinion or belief, is indeed possible. Knowledge is possible mainly because sometimes it's indeed actual. Not only are there times when we know, but there are times when we know that we know. When we know, we are not mistaken. Once this claim is granted, the forms, in Plato's view, are required to explain it. Without them, our knowledge and the existence of what is known could not be accounted for. Philosophers since Plato, beginning with his own student, Aristotle, have almost continuously discussed and quarreled about the theory of forms, often proposing other theories to replace it. But the alternatives proposed have often had more of Plato in them than their authors would admit. This was true, for example, even of Aristotle's dissenting view, when he wondered what practical use the theory of forms had. Where the objections to Plato or Platonism are strongest, the theories proposed as replacements encounter other difficulties, almost always as serious as the objections raised in the first place. Here, too, even in opposition, philosophy after Plato has stood constantly in his shadow. Although the theory of forms has certain abstract assumptions and consequences, Plato constantly reminds us that the evidence for the existence of the forms is very much present in the world of everyday experience. The forms provide a way to understand the differences among types of knowledge and between true and false values. They also serve as a basis for pursuing some values and rejecting others. In other words, knowledge is not something apart from the decisions that human beings make. Knowledge, in fact, provides the basis for making those decisions. Nor are Plato's concepts of knowledge and reason mere abstractions or theories. The impulse for the examined life, for learning, is, according to Plato, innate in man. The urge to know is a constant feature of human nature. Even when people don't act rationally, reason is still present. It's only been prevented by other causes from expressing itself. Sometimes, as we've seen, the emotions or senses imprison reason. One memorable example of this constant presence of reason appears in Plato's concept of love or desire, in Greek eros. If we ask, as so many people have, what love is, Plato's answer is that love is also the guise taken on by the impulse for wisdom, for philosophical knowledge. Desire, once we go below the surface of its appearance, is actually a desire for truth. At least Plato claims this in the much-admired dialogue entitled The Symposium. In the Symposium, Plato describes a festive gathering, a drinking party at which the guests, as part of the entertainment, give speeches in praise of love. These speeches form a pattern. First, Phaedrus and Pausanias speak about the relation between the lover and his beloved. For Phaedrus, the lover is to be praised most of all, since the lover is willing to sacrifice everything for love. Pausanias, on the other hand, extols the beloved as superior. He says that the beloved responds to love even when he knows that the lover may be deceitful or moved by base motives.
If anyone devotes himself to the service of another, in the belief that through him he will acquire wisdom or any other virtue, this willing servitude is not base. There is no shame either in being disappointed of such hopes. But any other kind of lover's hope, whether it comes true or not, is shameful.
The physician Eryximachus then provides a more clinical view. Love, he reports, is the harmony between violent desires and a more divine and gentler impulse. When the gentler impulse rules, it brings true happiness and friendship.
When love brings together all the opposites, it unites them in an ordered harmony. The result is health and plenty for mankind, and for the animal and vegetable kingdoms as well.
The writer of comedies, Aristophanes, then gives a comic account of love's passion. People were first created, Aristophanes explains, as beings in whom the two sexes were combined. Soon after their creation, however, those first creatures were split in half by the gods. The result of that split now is the passion we find as each one of those halves goes around in a constant search for the other half. Aristophanes describes this view of love.
So you see, gentlemen, how far back we can trace our innate love for one another, and how this love is always trying to reintegrate our former nature, to make two into one, and to bridge the gulf between one human being and another.
The first several speeches at the party thus refer to love only between people. Agathon, who speaks next, feels that the level of the discussion needs to be raised. In his speech, then, he describes love as a god, the source of beauty and of good.
Of all gods and men, an ornament, a guide most beautiful and best.
Agathon wants here to portray love as more than human. But in order to make his point, he goes to the other extreme, presenting love as divine only and not human at all. Socrates, speaking last, must bring Agathon and the discussion down to earth, at least part of the way. So Socrates points out to the assembly that love can't be beauty or goodness in themselves. The reason for this is that love is always love of something. And that means that love could occur only when there is a need or lack, which the lover wants to satisfy. The desire for something, even for beauty or good, implies that the person who has that desire does not already have that good, since if he had it, he wouldn't want it. This proves, in Socrates' view, that love can't itself be a god, since the gods lack for nothing. Socrates quotes a speech he once heard from a prophet, Diotima, about the origins of love. According to Diotima, the parents of love were need and plenty. The characters of those two parents then combine in their offspring, producing desire, which then propels love wherever it appears. So Socrates remembers Diotima's words.
As the son of plenty and need, love is always needy. Nor is he delicate and lovely as most of us believe. But on the one hand he is harsh and acid, always partaking of his mother's poverty. But then, too, on the other hand, he partakes of his father's plenty in his designs upon the beautiful and the good, for he is gallant, impetuous, a mighty hunter.
Desire begins first at the level of the senses, in the body's attraction to physical beauty, but that beauty is restricted. It's an incitement for something more. Desire moves further by pursuing the beauty which is common to individual physical bodies and which is accordingly not itself physical. Thus desire leads upward towards the form of beauty, a form present first in bodies, but more fully in souls and in knowledge. Finally, if the lover continues this ascent, he's rewarded with a view of beauty itself in perfect simplicity. Love, then, is distinctively human. The gods, because they have everything, don't need it. Creatures who are less than human are incapable of it. And all human beings are moved by love, whether they realize it or not. Anyone may stop at any of love's stages, including the first stage of the senses, but the desire that people experience is pointed beyond the senses, even if they don't always recognize this. The ideal of Platonic love is not physical love. It's not even love of a particular person. It is love of the form of beauty, which is ideal, eternal, and real. Diotima had described to Socrates this type of love.
If man's life is even worth the living, it is when he has attained this vision of the very core of beauty. And once you have seen it, you will care nothing for the beauties that used to take your breath away and kindle such a longing in you. For then you would see true beauty face to face.
Socrates' description of love is evidence that what is human is also related to the divine. With this flourish, Socrates completes his retelling of the story that Diotima first told him. Just when Socrates finishes speaking, the party is rudely interrupted by a number of new arrivals. Alcibiades, already drunk, enters and delivers an impromptu speech in praise of Socrates, whom he'd once tried to attract as a lover. Alcibiades lauds Socrates especially for his ability to resist both the temptations and the weaknesses of the senses. So he shouts out,
Fill up, Socrates, drink again. Not that you'll get any change out of him. It doesn't matter how much you give him, it never makes him drunk. It was the same when we once were in a battle together, and when we were once cut off from supplies. There was no one who put such a good face on it as he.
The party goes on, first noisily, with carousing, then gradually, as time passes, it quiets down. As with many drinking parties, some of the people fall asleep, some go home. Late in the night, Socrates is heard explaining to Aristophanes and Agathon that tragedy and comedy are closely related to each other. In fact, Socrates says the writer of tragedy will also be the writer of comedy, perhaps referring here to some of Plato's own writing. The dialogue, the symposium itself, ends as dawn breaks. Aristophanes and Agathon have also, finally, fallen asleep. Socrates alone seems unaffected by the hour or the drinking, as the narrator of the dialogue tells us.
After tucking up Aristophanes and Agathon, Socrates went on his way. He stopped at the Lyceum for a bath, and then spent the rest of the day as usual.
In this way, Socrates, known even among his friends for his homely looks, has the last word on the nature of beauty. So, too, Plato and Socrates come together here, as elsewhere, in their lives and thought. Plato writes philosophical dialogues as both comedy and tragedy. Socrates, the leading figure in those dialogues, represents the life of philosophy. This philosophical life occurs between the everyday world of appearance and the world of reason or mind. Although the world of reason may sometimes be less evident than the world of appearance, it is still more real than that world. There is quite simply no way to avoid reason, at least for human beings. The questions raised by philosophy, Plato insists, are constantly before us, whether we want to face them or not. There's no way of escaping those questions. There's no way of putting an end to them. Not in any event as long as we remain human rather than gods. So too, philosophy, which begins in wonder, also continues in wonder. And we are ever reminded of this by the way that Plato's dialogues lead us to ask not only Plato's questions, but our own as well.
We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of Plato by Knowledge Products. The script for this presentation is by Beryl Lang, Professor of Philosophy, State University of New York at Albany. The script is edited by John Locks of Vanderbilt University and Mike Hassel of Knowledge Products. Produced by Pat Childs. Vocal characterizations are by Rob Daniel, Travis Hardison, Cecil Jones, Bill Kolke, Paul Meyer, John Sherberg, and Robert Wynn. Music is by Ralph Childs. Recorded at Fred Jones Recording Services and Archer Productions. This material may not be copied in whole or in part without the written permission of the copyright owner. Copyright 1990 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated. This presentation of The Giants of Philosophy is a part of the Audio Classics series, a continuing series of cassettes presenting the major ideas of great thinkers with a discussion of their historical and intellectual context.